Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on July the 22nd. My name is Freddy Gray. I am the Spectator's World Edition editor and I'm going to be your host today. On today's show, we are going to be talking about freedom, or the lack of it, and the possibility that vaccine passports are back on the agenda. I'll be joined by Kate Andrews and Mark Walport to talk about it. After that, we're going to talk to Douglas Murray about freedom itself and whether the British people actually want to be free at all. Then we'll do a little section on politics. We'll talk to Katie and James about what's happening in Westminster. And then after that, we're going to do a section on Afghanistan and whether the West is right to withdraw. I'll be talking to Andrew Cockburn and Tom Tugendhat. And then finally, we're going to be talking to Sam Leith, our literary editor, who had the great misfortune of having his car stolen. You should probably subscribe to the Spectator magazine too. If you missed out on our PIMS offer last week, we've got another great deal for you. Get 12 weeks of the magazine for just £12. And we'll give you on top of that a free £20 Amazon voucher completely free. That's 3 months of The Spectator delivered to your door and available online for just £12 and a free £20 Amazon voucher. Just go to www.spectator.co.uk/TV offer to take it up. Now, first up, Freedom Day. Monday was allegedly Freedom Day, but it's been and gone and we don't feel necessarily more free. And I'm going to talk to Kate Andrews, who's our economics editor, and we're going to be discussing her cover piece in which she talks about how vaccine passports, COVID certificate identification, is back on the agenda. She'll be joined by Sir Mark Walport, who was the government scientific advisor between 2013 and 2017. Now, Kate, in your cover piece this week, you talk about the fact that not so long ago, maybe a few weeks, the British government seemed to be on a roll. The vaccine rollout was going very well. The government seemed to have a clear strategy as to what it was doing in terms of fighting COVID. And in the last 3 weeks, that's all gone a bit wrong and everything's become a little bit unhinged. What has actually happened?
Well, ministers don't want to talk about it, but they were pursuing a strategy of herd immunity for the autumn, not the way it was previously talked about when you would just have mass infection with no vaccines to protect the vulnerable, but one in which people were building up antibodies either through natural infection, but predominantly now through vaccination. A very different kind of strategy from the one before, but still one where we reached herd immunity come September, October time. And the Delta variant changed that equation. It's far more contagious, and they think that the threshold to achieve herd immunity is much higher. And so the fact that there seems to be more vaccine hesitancy among the young has meant that they've ramped up rhetoric that does not sound so much like Freedom Day, but actually a very new and quite sinister normal where we're not going back to our old ways, but we're ushering in a new era where we will have a tiered society, where people who are double jabbed will have significantly more rights to travel, to access certain kinds of venues than people who aren't jabbed. And I think there are a lot of issues with this. One, the fact that we have not even had a proper debate in Parliament yet. The second, that ministers promised in the wintertime, Michael Gove, Nadhim Zawahi, former Health Secretary Matt Hancock, that they weren't even considering something like this. Nadhim Zawahi called it discriminatory, which it would be by nature. And yet now we're in a situation where the government is announcing it as a fact. As I say in the cover piece, some people are calling their bluff. They're saying the government does not actually intend to bring in vaccine passports. This is a cynical ploy to get more young people to take up the vaccine. But I think, it almost doesn't matter whether it's cynical or not, although it certainly will matter if it's not and they're planning to bring them in and our lives change in that way. It's a fundamental break in the trust that we were supposed to have in our government, that they were leading us through this and being honest every step of the way. Now we're at a point where they're saying to us, I'm sorry, but it's not going to be as it once was. We're moving into something that looks a lot more like a biosecurity state. And it's not obvious that this is what people have signed up for.
I want to get back to vaccine passport in seconds, but Mark, first of all, the Delta variant has happened. We can't really blame the government for the Delta variant, but perhaps we can blame the government, don't you think, for suggesting hope that was perhaps beyond its reach?
Well, I mean, it is a communications balance between being, hopelessly optimistic or indeed severely pessimistic. And that is a very challenging line to follow. But I really disagree with the idea that there's something sinister going on here. And this has sort of become almost a libertarian battleground. But I think one's got to look at it rather carefully because, of course, it's people's liberty, in a sense, not to have a vaccine and to receive the harms that flow if you get infected. But the issue here is that vaccination protects you from infecting other people. And so that's a quite different argument. And in many countries, including the United States, you basically can't go to school until you've had a whole set of vaccines. You can't go to Harvard if you don't have an annual flu injection. In France and in Italy, compulsory vaccinations in childhood are the norm and have been for a long time. There are all sorts of situations where we legislate behaviour. And, to some extent, it is not only to protect yourself, but others. Seatbelts, there are all sorts of examples. And so it doesn't seem to me to be the most sort of terrible thing that actually if you want to go into an environment and it is basically indoors, crowded, poorly ventilated spaces where transmission is most likely to happen, then actually saying, well, if you want to do that, then you need to have 2 vaccines. This is not really a fundamental assault on liberty.
I suppose I see what you're saying, but I suppose the objection, and I don't think it's just mad libertarians that think this, is that there seemed to be a public debate, and the government seemed to have, in fact, said it was not going to go ahead with with vaccine passports, particularly not domestic vaccine passports, and yet now it's happening. So people feel that there's a sort of frivolous public debate that actually doesn't happen, and there's no parliamentary scrutiny, as Kate says. And then these things just go ahead.
It's clearly a good thing to have a public debate, and we're having the debate here, and I think that's absolutely fine. But of course, as the facts change, people have to change their plans. And, this is, in a sense, when I don't really like using sort of warlike metaphors, but the virus obeys one set of laws, which is the laws of Darwinian evolution. And essentially, those variants of the virus that make it able to transmit more easily, and those behaviours by humans that make it easier to transmit more easily, are good for the virus and bad for us. And the challenge is, it's not as though this is a completely benign disease if you're young. It's predominantly young people that are ending up in hospital. And if they've had a pneumonia, even if it doesn't kill them, there's a significant risk that they'll have quite long-term lung disease. And so the sort of spectre of long COVID, which is a whole variety of different things, is quite significant. And it's a much nastier infection than flu, and you don't really want to have flu either. So it seems to me that, the government did not anticipate that they would have 50,000 cases a day nearly of a new variant at the time when they were hoping to open up. The vaccination programme has been an extraordinary success, but perhaps not surprisingly, as it reaches younger age groups who feel themselves more sort of immortal, there is a bit more hesitancy. And this does 2 things. I mean, A, it does actually, if introduced in this form, it does incentivise them to do it.
Well, can we say the vaccination...
At the end of the day, that's got to be a good thing to do.
Can we say the vaccination programme has been such a success? Certainly the initial rollout was successful, but it seems to be slowing down, and it seems that the vaccine is not as successful in stopping transmission as was first anticipated.
Well, no, it was never. I mean, frankly, the vaccines have been much more successful than the scientific community expected in the first place. Firstly, almost 90% of adults have now had 1 vaccine dose, and they're heading towards a second dose. That's a pretty successful program. I mean, much more than in almost every other country in the world. And secondly, it's always recognised that there's a sort of threshold of effectiveness of vaccines. And what the vaccines are doing is they are largely protecting, though not completely, people against the most severe effects of disease. So they are reducing hospitalizations and they are reducing deaths. There's no doubt about that. But they are a bit less effective at introducing mild symptomatic disease and asymptomatic disease. Frankly, this is, humans against natural biology. It's very difficult to overcome the forces of nature, and vaccines have been arguably, alongside clean water, the major public health measures that have changed human health and survival over the last couple of centuries.
It seems as though the government has learned from the example of France in this particular instance, because the French saw an uptake in vaccination rates among young people when they introduced a little, as you would call it, nudge, as others might say, coercion into society. Kate, do you think, you say that vaccine hesitancy will increase with coercion, but the example of France suggests that it won't, and that what Mark calls an inertia might go down with a bit more nudging?
Well, I think if you're genuinely vaccine hesitant, I think, seeing the way that this narrative has changed is probably going to shove you towards the skeptic direction. But as we write in this week's magazine, the heavy fist of the state can actually be very convincing. And in France, we're seeing mass protests, but we've also seen uptake of the jab amongst young people, I think, go up at roughly 75% since he brought in such extreme vaccine passport rules. It can work. The question is whether or not as a society we are comfortable with this kind of not nudge but force, the threat that you will deprive a person of their liberty because they're not doing something that you're claiming is voluntary. We also have to remember that the government is still very insistent that these vaccines are voluntary, but they're just going to continue to take away parts of your life until you do what they want. And it's moving. But just very quickly, it's moving. It's moving very fast. About a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, the government published its guidance for business saying that they would help them to develop a system to check people's vaccination status. It was voluntary, with a little note at the bottom saying, if you don't do this, by the way, we do reserve the right to make you. Less than 2 weeks later, they're making them. This is what's so incredible, is that they're working with the narrative of choice, and yet they're bringing in this force. And because Parliament hasn't been sitting properly, we haven't had the chance to call this out properly and say, wait a second, we have not actually signed up or agreed to this. It goes against our principles. Is it really worth doing this?
But the paradox in a way is that actually the UK is probably the only country in the world that's sort of taken off the brakes in terms of social interaction at a time when the case numbers are rising. And, the fear is that when you've got 50,000 a day, and we haven't really talked about all the pings, but the pings actually reflect the fact that lots of people are being exposed to people who've tested positive. The app is actually doing what it's supposed to do, although inevitably there are some false positives and indeed false negatives amongst that. So that's the paradox, which is that actually this is a government that doesn't actually like legislative controls on behaviour, so the brakes have come off. But it's at a time when the COVID car, as it were, is travelling at 90 miles an hour down a hill. That's the challenge. And so, are they going to be forced to introduce more rules depending on what happens with the numbers? And what the modelling does show is that if you are cautious, and the guidance is to be cautious, then we're likely to have a smaller peak than if you simply return to complete pre-COVID behaviour. So, it's a dilemma for the government in a way, which is they've got a fast accelerating car. Are they going to put some form of rules back on the environments where the transmission is likely to be most rampant?
But lastly then, Mark, do you think the problem then is not, obviously, that there is some Orwellian state in the making, but just that the government doesn't have a clue what it's doing, and in a way that's more sinister?
Well, I pity the policymaker. It's a very, very difficult job they've got at the moment. This is one of the toughest sets of decisions. And, it's going to be scrutinised in the finest detail for years to come. But it is genuinely difficult when you've got a virus that, as I say, is not really interested in policy at all. It's a very, very successful virus, this one, actually, and it will continue to mutate. So they're having to make decisions on the hoof. And, I would rather have policymakers who change their minds in the face of the facts changing. And the mantra for some months has been data, not dates, although the dates have been pretty dominant in some of the decision making recently. But having said that, I would like policymakers to respond to evidence.
Kate, it's very easy for journalists like us to criticise to criticise the government in what is an unprecedented crisis. Should we just show them a little bit more charity? I
think actually a lot of good faith has been administered for this government. We've had debates on Spectator TV defending our editor, Fraser Nelson, defending their decision to delay Freedom Day by 4 weeks.
We were all shocked by that.
You can try to sympathize, but when they have these emergency powers which control our lives in such an extreme way, and when we're talking about not getting rid of all rules, but exchanging the old rules for new rules that are indefinite and potentially completely change the relationship between the individual and the state, sympathy has to go out the window. You have to scrutinize that, because if you don't, you end up, I think, in a much darker place. And let's hope that the cynics are right. Let's hope that this is all a bluff, and that Boris Johnson, the once liberal editor of The Spectator, he said that he would tear up an identity card if he were ever asked to show it and eat it in front of the official who asked for it. Let's hope that deep down in his heart, he comes round and realizes what a bad idea it would be to carve up society based on their health status. But as they're announcing they're going to do it, saying this is coming in without even having gone to Parliament first, I think our only job, Freddie, for the next few weeks is to follow this and be critical and investigate it.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Mark. I'm now joined by Douglas Murray, and we're going to be talking about freedom and whether British people actually want it. Douglas, you, in your brilliant column this week, you talk about how there was an expectation that the 2020s were going to be the roaring 20s. And in fact, what you say is that they're going to become the boring 2020s. What do you mean by that?
Yes, this refers to something I actually referred to in a column earlier this year as well. Nick Christakis, a distinguished American academic, made headlines in a way that American academics tend not to across the UK earlier this year, when he said in passing that perhaps the 2020s would be like the 1920s, a great roaring decade, and that just as the 1920s were this great roaring decade following the Great War, so perhaps after the Corona era we would have this great roaring party decade of the 2020s. Of course, there's a reason why the media and everyone else wanted to pick up on that. It's a sort of terrific story. It's a great claim. And it's, for a lot of people at any rate, something to look forward to. I pointed out, by the way, when I last mentioned this story, that there's an obvious problem with it, which is that for most people, the 1920s weren't all that roaring. For a relatively small segment of society they were, but for most people they just had to get on with their jobs, with their lives. They weren't all at cocktail parties with the bright young things, and of course the whole decade ended in a crash. So I wasn't at all sure that I wanted the 2020s to be roaring like that, and if it was going to be one great big orgy, then I suspect, as always, that the benefits would accrue to a relatively small number of people, and most people wouldn't get a look in. However, yes, I've just expanded on this in my column this week, really to make a bit of a wider point, which is that there has been a feeling, I think, through the pandemic, that once we sort of got through it, we were really going to live again. You know, people were really just going to want to get out there. They were going to want to do all of the things they hadn't been allowed to do. The horrible 18 months we've had, perhaps longer, would be forgotten and made up for. And actually, as I say in my column, I think the signs are rather in the opposite direction. All the polls show a very significant chunk of the British public who don't even want to mew, let alone roar, quite happy staying home in the garden for the rest of their lives, want that even if all the restrictions are lifted and even if all of the measurements to meet those restrictions are met. And then you've got the other cultural issues, the other wider issues, which particularly I mentioned in the column, is this very strange early warning sign we already have of the extraordinary opprobrium that's being shown to anyone who is sort of wanting to get back out there. There's a deep sniffiness in the air, particularly in Britain, a sort of sniffiness of the people wanting to get back out there, particularly, and I think this is one of the most unsettling things, the deep sniffiness about young people wanting to get back out there. And I think this in particular is quite wrong and must be resisted.
Is it something that's getting worse? Because, I mean, I think there's always been a sort of undercurrent of suspicion of fun in Britain. We sort of came from Puritanism after all. And I suppose from what I got from your piece is that perhaps what's happened is we're reverting to what we were before, which is a nation of people who don't really trust people being outdoors and enjoying themselves. We're suspicious of public pleasure.
Yes, that's right. I always think of that great H.L. Mencken quote about Puritanism. He defined Puritanism famously as the sneaking fear that someone somewhere was having fun. There's a great streak of this in Britain, always has been. And I think it's been exacerbated in the last year because although we may not have the Puritan religion, we have the version of it that replaces God with the NHS, for instance. That you are risking the NHS by having fun. You are failing to do your bit to protect the great national institution and the great national deity. That you're being selfish by enjoying yourself and going out. And as I say, that in particular, this is likely to push a generational divide that's already there. And generational divides already exist. But a generational divide that's particularly there in the case of this virus. Because what young people, I'm in my 40s now, so I don't think I count as that anymore, but what young people in their late teens and 20s have had to give up in the last 18 months is very significant. They have been, as I say in the piece, they have been forced to, for instance, if their students study alone, many of them have lived alone, they've missed the opportunity to meet their peers, they've been told, unless they're in a stable relationship, to be not just monogamous, but actually to be chaste. The government has told them to be virgins, or to at least engage in 2 years of chastity. They have, if they've followed the rules, they've done that. I'm not sure how many have, incidentally, but if they follow the rules, they've done that. This is a generation that has missed a significant amount of its lives and its opportunities to meet friends, to meet partners. They've studied alone, they've run up student debts alone, they've graduated alone, and I don't at all blame them that they now want to get out there for a virus that, as can't be said often enough, has almost no effect, has almost a negligible effect on people of their age group. So this great demand has been made of them, and I think there's this lingering sense that they should, as it were, keep staying at home, even though we have had the vaccine now, the vaccine that by any standard should be the passport out of this terrible, ghastly era. Even after that, there's this sniffiness that they would want to go out to these large-scale events. And I think it's cruel, I think it's unusually cruel, and I think that all the sort of adults engaging in that sniffiness should really think about that.
I suppose it's crueler than Puritanism in many ways, or any kind of theocratic thinking, because they're not saying to people, you don't sort of indulge your vices because it's bad for you. They're saying don't do it because you might harm someone else. Yes,
that's right. You might harm the NHS, you'll put the NHS under strain, and you'll kill other people. As I say, we get back to this thing, either the vaccine is the way out or it isn't. And if it's the way out, then life has got to return to normal. And I do, from my own observation, keep noticing that it's Britain that seems to be worst in recognising this. The Americans do seem to realise, I've made this comparison in a number of places, the Americans do seem to realise, once the vaccine's in, you make your choice about whether you take it or not, but then you just get back out there. And the British don't seem to have taken that view. I mean, partly because the government very, very misguidedly suggested earlier this year that the vaccine wasn't why cases had fallen and that actually it was lockdown. But, if the vaccine isn't the way out, then there is no way out of this. And I think that's something that the British in particular have got to focus on. But yes, you're right, there is this sort of, as we see in the public health campaigns of recent weeks and months, where people are being shown scary images of people dying and basically being told this would be something you'd caused if you were to flout the rules, is a form of coercion which is not just ugly but untrue.
Well, perhaps the martyr of your piece, if I could use that word, is Charlie Perry, the football fan who stuck a red flare up his bottom and lit it. And it was a sort of viral sensation. The video of it was a viral sensation. And he received enormous amounts of opprobrium and sort of disgust, really. And that very much speaks to what you're saying, that we are appalled at the idea that someone would go out and behave irresponsibly in a way that British people might have been in the 50s.
Yes, I mean, I should stress Charlie Perry is a slightly unusual hero, but nevertheless, it's important to get this right. Yes, as you say, Mr. Perry is a 25-year-old roofer who was very excited, I think we can say that, about the England final in the Euros playing against Italy. And Mr. Perry came to some national notoriety in Britain. We should stress this for our international viewers. Mr. Perry came to some notoriety, indeed made the front page of a number of newspapers, because on the relevant match day, he went large, as you might say. He drank, he thinks, about 20 cans of cider, which is quite a lot. And he also managed to get into the ground for free by jigging his way in, apparently they call it. And so he was absolutely thrilled by the whole day. Couldn't have been happier. And expressed this happiness in some ways a traditional way. By taking his trousers down in Leicester Square, taking his trousers down, shoving a flare up his backside and lighting it. And it may not be how you or I would celebrate England reaching the finals of the Euros, but for Mr. Perry it seemed to be the mot juste, just the ticket. And he actually said this. The press, after vilifying him, they caught up with him, and he said in an interview, he's just thought that after 18 months, really miserable months, he thought that people needed a bit of cheering up. So it was a sort of public service in a way in Mr. Perry's mind. He certainly saw it that way. And of course it is a dangerous thing to do, and we should stress, in case there are any children watching, that this is not advisable. Mr. Perry didn't actually feel, fortunately, the sparks from the flare in his anus, because he drunk 20 cans of cider. And if you're going to avoid, it turns out, the back flare of a flare, 20 cans of cider is your necessary precursor.
Yeah. But there are better ways of letting off steam, is what we all need to.
Yes, and sparks. And so Mr. Perry did this, and what was interesting about it was that this is to my mind, I mean, as I say, you and I may not favour this sort of form of celebration, but this is pretty much what I expect of England football fans. It's the sort of thing they do. And the crowd in Leicester Square was absolutely thrilled. It went down very well among his friends and his newly acquired friends. It was just the nation as a whole that reacted with this universal opprobrium to it, which I just thought was rather interesting, because I don't think he should be a national hero, but nor should he be regarded as a sort of national villain. And there was this complete, across the media, there was this thing of what a terrible thing to do, what an awful example to set, what does this tell us about our nation, what sort of image does this send out? And I just say that this reaction is an example of something which we've seen as well in the reaction to young people going out to nightclubs since Monday. This general sort of sense that I don't like these things and therefore these things are wrong. And my own view is that, within the limits of the law, if you don't like things, don't do them. And don't be around people who do them. I mean, don't go to Leicester Square on a match day when you know it's going to be full of lagered up football louts trying to set light to their backsides. So just sort of one of the principles of a tolerant society is that you let people do things that you wouldn't yourself do, so long as they're within the law.
Thank you very much for joining us, Douglas. Let's go back to Westminster and talk to Katie Balls and James Forsyth about the week that is going on in SW1. James, in your brilliant politics column this week, you talk about how Boris Johnson has addressed the biggest policy issue of our times, which is social care, and he has a big new plan on how to deal with it. Can you tell us a little bit about what he's thinking, what's going on, and what it says about the direction that this government is going in?
So 2 years ago, when Boris Johnson first became Prime Minister, he promised that he had a plan to fix social care. In the Tory manifesto, he repeated that, said no one would have to pay for their house to cover the cost of their social care. But I think it's fair to say that this plan was more an aspiration to have a plan than a detailed plan. But I think if it wasn't for the fact that the Health Secretary Sajid Javid has tested positive for COVID, sending himself and Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak into self-isolation this week, I think we would have seen a social care policy. I think the expectation in Whitehall is that this policy would be that national insurance or some kind of levy within national insurance will rise to cover the costs of a cap on social care costs and to provide some money to deal with the NHS backlog, with NHS waiting list now at 5 million people. Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, said that it might rise to 13 million people. And I think I think this raises some big political questions. First of all, this is a Tory government raising taxes to put more money into the health service. Now, you can say that they're doing that to honour their manifesto pledge on social care, but that also involves breaking a manifesto pledge not to raise income tax, national insurance or VAT. I think it raises an interesting dilemma for Labour, which is where does the Labour Party go when the Tory party is pulling off the trick that Gordon Brown did in 2002 of raising tax with the explicit aim of putting that extra revenue into the health service. And I think at the moment, this is a relatively politically not that risky for the Tories. There is no party to the right of them in British politics. The low tax right of the Tory party is not as politically powerful as it was. But I think the question is, in the long term, what are you going to do? Because this isn't going to be the last time that the health service requires more money. And I think there is a danger that unless you think about the size of a state, that, the old joke about Pakistan, that it's a military of a country attached, could end up being applicable to Britain, that, we could be a health service of a country attached.
Katie, I suppose, as James says, Labour are a bit stumped by this, but one would expect a little bit of Tory resistance. Is there any sign of opposition in the ranks?
Yes, and we heard some this week in the sense that a cabinet minister giving an interview, Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary, suggested that national insurance wouldn't be the right way to solely pay for this. And I think it reflects a wider unease in the Tory party about whether, I think there's 2 points here. Is the deal not proposal, which is what the Prime Minister favours, which is very expensive, benefits voters in the south potentially more, given at higher property prices, in terms of protecting inheritance, whether it's the right one for the current party in terms of its coalition. And then also, even if you say that is the right policy, is a national insurance hike ultimately the right way to pay for this? Because that is going to affect working age more than anyone else unless you bring something extra in. And is it right that we have a situation where the people who are at least immediately benefiting from this won't be the ones contributing to it, given we've got lots of intergenerational problems to begin with? And I think that, as James has touched on, there was a sense that the Prime Minister wanted to announce it this week and almost just get it done, but there hadn't been much to float it with MPs. Now we have a situation situation where all the plans have eked out, and you have months potentially of Tory MPs thinking about this, potentially complaining about it, it's quite good at that, and causing issues. I think it makes it harder potentially to land this as a policy.
James, speaking in a more sort of global sense, is there any sort of coalition anywhere in the Western world for individual responsibility, a kind of Thatcherite conservatism? It seems that that's been abandoned everywhere.
Yeah, I think that if you look around the world for a low tax, small state centre-right party, you would struggle to find one. If you exclude the Japanese, because they are their politics is slightly different, the only centre-right finance minister in the G7 is Rishi Sunak, and I think I think politics has clearly moved in this direction. I think that we are. I mean, we've discussed this in the Spectator before, Fred. We are moving into an era of a bigger state and bigger government. And I think one of the things that Katie touched on in her answer is one of the challenges, those southern Tory seats that you would expect to normally be the home of kind of low tax fiscal conservatism, to them, protecting the right to pass on their house to their children is that trumps low taxes in their hearts and minds. That is the gamble that Boris Johnson is taking. And I think if you talk to Tory MPs, it's a fairly safe one. In those prosperous commuter belt seats, people, the guarantee that they won't end up having to sell their house for care is more important to them than a belief in low taxes. One might cynically add, particularly because the tax the Tories are thinking about raising is not one paid by the over 65s.
Katie, do you think recalcitrant Tory MPs are just going to have to get with the big state programme on this?
I think they're going to have to get with the big state programme, but I also think that in terms of who pays and what, I think some of that is still to play for, because Boris Johnson has a majority of around 80. And ultimately, I think that has been shown to not be quite what it seemed on paper. I think this government actually has an issue driving reform, and we're going to see more of that because Tory MPs aren't particularly happy, and ultimately they can show that with votes when it comes to various parts of legislation. So I think we are heading to a government that will raise taxes in some form and break manifesto pledges. But I think in terms of how exactly that plays out, I think there is still some battles to come.
James, there is another political story that's bubbling up that we should talk about this week, and that's Northern Ireland. The UK wants to have another look at the trading protocol. Can you explain in layman's terms, please, what's going on there?
I'll do my best, Fred. So the Northern Ireland Protocol was signed as part of the withdrawal agreement. So it was signed by the British government when Boris Johnson first became Prime Minister, when it was still a hung parliament. And it essentially conceded that in various ways Northern Ireland would remain in the single market and the customs union even after Brexit, but it would still also be in the UK customs union. There are a whole bunch of procedures in this. I think the UK government agreed this to get a deal done, because it wanted a deal to fight the election on. And it is now seeking what it admits are substantial changes to the protocol. The EU's reaction has been predictably to say no, and then in private to point out, hang on a second, this is the Prime Minister who negotiated this protocol, who signed this protocol. How can he now say that he wants changes to it? I think the kind of question is, does this become a kind of frozen dispute almost, where the two sides agree to a standstill, the UK doesn't invoke Article 16, the EU slows its legal actions against the UK, and we just exist in a situation where this is a kind of, a kind of frozen negotiation that just sits there with neither side prepared to totally push it, but both prepared to live with the kind of messiness of the moment. Or, as I think there are lots of people in Brussels and in various EU member states think the EU should do, say, no, look, we've got to, the UK signed this, we've got to push them to abide by it. And I think it is interesting as well, the UK's proposals for changes to the protocol. These aren't tweaks, these are really substantial changes. And I think one of the other big questions is this an opening maximalist negotiating position from the UK side? Or is this them saying, unless we get all this, we will invoke Article 16 and everyone will have to go back to the drawing board?
I understood that very well. Thank you, James. More Brexit limbo is the gist.
As always with Northern Ireland, it's never quite done.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Katie. Now, on to Afghanistan. It seems as though the war in Afghanistan, the forever war as it's often been called, is finally over. Western forces are withdrawing, but is that morally the right thing to do? Do we owe anything more to Afghanistan as the Western powers who invaded it? I'm joined now by Tom Tugendhat, who's chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and Andrew Cockburn, who is Washington editor of Harper's magazine. Tom, I'll start with you. As someone who's served in Afghanistan, you clearly think that we have let down the region and we've let down ourselves and caused more danger for the West by withdrawing from this conflict. Can you explain to me why you think that?
Yes, of course. I think there was a strong argument to make that the UK and the United States should not have got into nation building. There was certainly a very strong argument to make in 2001 that the destruction of the Taliban, or rather the destruction of Al-Qaeda, was the key aim, and we should have walked away at that point. But after we'd invested so much in the last 10 years, the fighting really stopped for the West, certainly for the United States and the UK, about 4 years ago. Since then, we've actually been enabling Afghan security forces. There's been about 10,000 NATO troops, 2,500 or so US troops, enabling some 400,000 Afghan national security forces. Now, you can argue that they shouldn't have got into the mission in the first place, but the idea that that was a major commitment is not sustainable when you look at the hundreds of thousands of US troops deployed in places like South Korea or Germany. It simply is a statement that what we were doing was actually trying to buy a bit of time for the governments or the various different parties to negotiate, and in withdrawing, what we did was pull the rug under all.
I suppose the obvious question then is, how much time do we need? How much time does Afghanistan need? It's been 20 years. Does the West have a responsibility to be a kind of security operation in Afghanistan into the indefinite future?
I don't think the West really is part of the security solution, except at the most basic level. But that doesn't mean that it's not an important element within it. And the reality is, some of our security forces have endured for many, many years before they've actually been able to withdraw easily. If you look at Germany, for example, the last day of fighting in 1945 was not the final victory. The final victory was the fall of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. And the same is true in South Korea. The reality is, in many ways, the war isn't over, in the sense that US troops are still guaranteeing South Korean prosperity and ensuring stability in the area. But the choice isn't simply, do we stay or do we go? But what are the alternatives to staying and what are the alternatives to going? And here, the alternative to staying is an empowered Taliban, likely with Chinese support through Pakistan, and a different perception of the United States and the West around the world. Now, that's a choice. I think it's an unwise one, but it is a choice, and that's the choice that President Biden has made.
Andrew, I'll bring you in now. You've written a brilliant piece for the upcoming edition of Spectator World about the costs of war in Afghanistan to the Pentagon. And I think we'll get onto that in a second. But first of all, could you just respond to what Tom has said there? I imagine you disagree.
Well, I do. I mean, not totally, because I agree with what he said, that it was a great mistake for them to 20 years ago, or to get into the business of nation building, which was done in a very crass way, but that's for a discussion another time. But unfortunately, if there'd been steady progress, if the whole thing had been working, then there might have been an argument for staying. But clearly, for the last 4 years and for the many years before that, the thing was basically going nowhere. I mean, everyone I've talked to, who's been in the military, been in the US, State Department, they all would have been confiding for years that they felt this was, not going to succeed, that the Afghan security forces, because of the ramshackle and highly corrupt state apparatus that we'd really created or certainly fostered. This was, a hiding to nowhere. And actually we've had high-level confirmation of that from the so-called Afghanistan papers, which were finally revealed in the Washington Post a while ago. It turned out that all the US generals were saying in private for 20 years, this war is unwinnable. We're never going to succeed. They said something different to us, the taxpayers, but, privately, they didn't believe it. So I'm afraid, I'm sorry that it's, going to certainly, result in more suffering and misery in Afghanistan, but it already was. I mean, it's, for years now, quite a while, we've been hearing that the government forces were causing more civilian casualties than the Taliban. This was not anything on the way to success.
What do you make of this argument that Afghanistan, we hear it quite a lot, that Afghanistan will become a terrorist haven again following withdrawal?
Well, I really don't buy it. I mean, the terrorists have found lots of other places to find havens ever since then, notably Syria. But the Taliban, I think they've learnt a lot in the years of the fighting comeback, and one of them is not to attract people, to take a headline role in headquartering a terrorist organization that's attacking the United States. So I really don't think that we're going to see a prominent Al-Qaeda or ISIS, presence in Afghanistan here on in.
Tom, do you disagree with that?
Not terribly, except that I don't think that the Taliban is a thing, so the Taliban doesn't actually have the choice. The Taliban is simply a brand name given to anybody who doesn't like the government. Plenty of them are very closely allied to ISIS today already, and are harbouring them today already, as we saw with the murder of the Halo Trust people in Badakhshan only a few weeks ago. So, I mean, it's not that the Taliban has made a geopolitical choice to harbour or not to harbour terrorists. It's that it is a completely diffuse bunch of warlords of different sizes, some of whom are quite happy harbouring terrorists and some of whom see the dangers that brings.
What about this China point? Do you think, Andrew, that we should worry about China getting involved in this graveyard of empires, as it's often called, or might some people think if China wants to get bogged down in Afghanistan, then that might not be the worst news for the West?
Well, yeah, very good point. I mean, I think it'd be wonderful. Well, it'd be very sad, actually, if unfortunate Afghans were subject to another 40 years of war. But it wouldn't be great for the Chinese to, try and do what we failed to do and what the Russians failed to do, which is to somehow control Afghanistan.
Tom, do you think China wants to control Afghanistan in the way that America, or not control, but wants to sort of have the kind of influence that America and Britain did in Afghanistan? I know that it has quite a lot of sway in Pakistan. Does it want to do the same thing in Afghanistan?
It certainly wants to have some influence. I'm not quite sure I'd say it's the same, but it wants to have some influence. They've already got quite serious economic interests in terms of copper mining and things like that. They already have some strategic interests. We know that they've reached out to some Taliban groups about the Uyghur Muslim population in Xinjiang, trying to silence any potential connections between the two groups. So they're clearly concerned about it. Whether or not they want to do much more, motorways or train lines or whatever, I don't know. I mean, I would be surprised. I think that'd be rather ambitious. But, they certainly are looking at Afghanistan, as many countries have looked at Afghanistan for many years, as a potential place of danger and unrest and something they wish to control. And, the US did the same, admittedly from rather greater range. And effectively what it's just done is its massive cost saving is a saving of 1,900 troops. That's it. That's less than a brigade.
Well, there's obviously the human element, but Andrew, you've written this piece about the extraordinary costs of this war, and I mean, perhaps I'm putting too much spin on it, but I would say that what I got from that piece was that the Afghanistan war became a kind of extortion racket for arms firms and the Pentagon to extract more and more money out of this crisis. And I was very interested that there was actually a a particular budget that the Pentagon had to do operations in Afghanistan on top of its enormous budget. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Right, it was called Overseas Contingency Funds, which, as I say in the piece, is rather like a police department charging extra for chasing criminals. The Defense Department is there presumably to defend us and to wage war if necessary, and then they were charging extra for fighting in Afghanistan and in Iraq and the troop deployments in Syria and a whole bunch of other places in Northern Africa and so forth. That's now come to an end, I think, quite rightly. I mean, if they're, it's ridiculous to have this sort of add-on for the privilege of defending us or fighting our wars.
Well, I agree completely that generals shouldn't be used to make political statements. I think it's absolutely absurd. If a war is worth fighting, the politicians should justify it and the soldiers should fight it. If it is not worth fighting, the soldiers should stop fighting it. But at no stage should the military have a say in whether or not an operation is achievable. We have militaries that are controlled by elected politicians, and there's a purpose for that.
But in a democracy, politicians should be answerable to the people, and it seems certainly in America, it seems from we saw with Donald Trump and now with Biden that withdrawing from Afghanistan and ending the forever wars is a popular move. Why should politicians not do what the American or the British public want?
Well, I think the American public and British public want many things, and they're absolutely right that we don't want to be engaged in forever wars. And I think I made this point in 2001, 2002, that getting drawn in was probably a mistake. And, I certainly made the argument in private then. I'm not sure anybody was listening, but I did make it then. And the reality is that we've now got ourselves into a situation whereby certainly 5-6 years ago, most of the fighting had finished, to the extent that we have 2,500 US troops, of whom 1,900 are withdrawing, and 600 are still staying to guard the embassy anyway. So it's the withdrawal of about half a brigade combat team, not a credible fighting unit in the United States terms, that has simply been enabling. Now, you may argue that it wasn't achieving anything anyway. That's a legitimate argument. I argue that it was sustaining at least some form of stability. Was it moving in the right direction? Well, it wasn't a complete failure. And for that investment, maybe it was worth it. Now, the sunk costs that Andrew has spoken about are absolutely real, but there's no way they're coming back. That money is spent. Those men, sadly, are dead. We're not bringing them back. The decision is, what do we do going forward, not how do we correct the past?
I'd just like to make one observation here, which is that it's slightly misleading to think of the US involvement recently as just 1,900 troops. I mean, the main contribution they've been making is air power out of Bagram, I think out of Kandahar too. They were still flying out of there, particularly using drones. Oh, okay, not Kandahar. So that was the crucial component, really propping up the Afghan security situation. And I just want to say one other thing. I'm talking a lot about the money.
I agree.
Talking about the money, in a way, I think the money was part of the problem. I mean, John Subko, who was the Special Inspector General that I quote in the piece for Afghan reconstruction, he said, we've created a state, or we're supporting a state, we're enabling a $10 billion budget for a state that could otherwise only sustain a $2 billion budget. In other words, it was an unsustainable state without us, without this massive infusion of aid, which I think when the former ambassador, Ryan Crocker, said a few years ago, US ambassador, said, pouring that huge amount of money into a fragile society, a fragile state apparatus, you're inevitably going to have massive corruption. So the idea that, it's a particularly American thing of throwing more and more money at a problem in, hopes that that'll produce a solution actually helps ensure failure. And that's what we did in Afghanistan.
Can I ask you, just to close it, very briefly, I'll start with Tom. Do you think we have ended our involvement in Afghanistan, or do you think we are going to find ourselves drawn back in because of the situation in Afghanistan, and as it unravels, there'll be a humanitarian crisis, and our involvement is not, in fact, over?
No, I think this is really the end of our involvement in Afghanistan. The idea that we could get very involved in a humanitarian crisis if we don't have the ability to oversee at least some of it through agencies or through different forms of envoys, I think is unlikely. I mean, let's see, right? But it strikes me that the withdrawal of the troops means effectively the embassies and the aid work will wind down as well, maybe not immediately, but certainly over coming years. And that in reality is the end of our involvement. Andrew?
Well, I absolutely agree. I don't think the American public would stand for, the Congress would stand for, Afghanistan 2 or 3. It's inconceivable, and it's actually be very difficult. One thing we haven't, I know we're out of time, but we haven't mentioned in this discussion is Pakistan. And Pakistan, was always the man behind the curtain in this. The Taliban, whatever you want to call them, wouldn't have made the comeback they have without consistent support in Pakistan, and that Pakistan was going to make very sure, actually, I think that we never succeeded. We never had a stable government supporting us in Kabul, controlling the countryside. And, now, of course, we don't have a base anywhere nearer than the Gulf, so it'd be very hard to intervene again.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Tom. Now, finally, we're going to be talking about the rise of convenience technology and the decline of Western civilization. I'm joined by Sam Leith, our literary editor, who had the misfortune of having his car stolen last week. And I'd like Sam to tell me a little bit about how that happened. Sam, over to you.
Well, we have this car, which, as I say in the piece, it's not a really fancy car, but it's a slightly fancy car. It's the nicest car I've ever had. It's a Land Rover Discovery Sport, which is kind of entry-level SUV type thing, and suitable for carting my family of 5, including 3
I've got to interrupt you there and say I was actually very impressed by the smartness of your car.
Oh, well, thank you.
I thought, how does a journalist get that, was my first thought.
Oh, well, he's vastly overpaid by the Spectator, as you know.
We all are.
We all are. Anyway, so we have this quite fancy car, and it's great because it has 7 seats, so you can put the children right at the back, and, it actually drives rather than simply slowing down when you try and approach around, sort of go up a hill or whatever. Anyway, so very happy with the car. It's got this keyless fancy entry fob, which I was like, that's great. No more, difficulty in having to turn the key, or you just have it in your pocket, you climb in, off you go. It's lovely. Anyway, the keyless thing means that it's very, very easy, it turns out, for thieves to nick them. And as the police told us, when on Saturday morning we discovered it gone, they said, Land Rover. Land Rovers, Range Rovers and keyless Jaguars are the ones that are stolen all the time. But sorry, our story, I'll tell you the things. On Friday night, my wife arrives home with the children from wherever she's been with them, unloads them, leaves the car on the drive just outside the front of the house. We live on quite a busy street in London, but we've got a bit of off-street parking, so there's the car there. And on Saturday morning, she goes out in order to drive off to go to football, and goes, "Where's the car?" I said, "Obviously, it's where you've left it. You drove it last. It was in the front drive." She went, "No, it isn't." And of course, it had just gone. No broken glass, no nothing, just vanished. And I mean, this is another story, but she finally made it to football, I think in an Uber or on her bicycle, and then fractured her foot. And 24 hours later, she was diagnosed with COVID. So it was a very bad week for us. But anyway, there we are. Car is missing. And it turns out, like, our neighbour has CCTV on their drive. So just out of the corner of the thing, you can see this person, you can see it like 4:45 in the morning, just see the corner of our car in the corner of the screen, and somebody, just kind of character, just appears in the corner, opens the door, climbs in and drives off, just as if they'd had the key, which presumably they did. I mean, not actually the key, but there's different ways they can do it. They either clone the key, or they kind of get hold of the signal from the key because you've left it near the front of the house, which we didn't, so I don't know how that happened.
They boost it.
So
They boost the
They
signal.
boost it, yeah. One of the ways they do it, and I was sort of on the qui-vive for this because I'd read somewhere that keyless car theft was kind of easy, and therefore, when you have your key, you should keep it a long way away from the car. Not by the front door or on the windowsill, which is where lots of people leave it. But they come up to the front of the house with a doohickey, I think is the technical term, and that picks up the signal and then boosts it off to another doohickey, which is next to your car, which then fools the car into thinking the key's in it, and off it goes. Not quite sure, once they've driven to wherever they're going, they then restart it. Not sure how they do that. They can't use their signal booster anymore, but no doubt they have ways.
Well, reading your account and hearing you tell it, I was just reminded of, it happened to us once that our car, we looked out the front of the house and the car was missing, but it was actually because we were living in America at the time, and it was on a hill, and it was a Jeep, and the handbrake had come off, and it just rolled down the bottom of the hill.
Had come off.
And then been taken away by a impounding local impounding service. So we eventually got it back, but it took a while. But that was a very old and crummy car. What I'm struck by in what you're saying is that it seems to be the more expensive your car, because I know it happens with Teslas too, the more likely it is to get stolen, which is quite a strange.
Well, it's not strange that the more expensive your car, the more likely it is to get stolen. I think what's strange is that the more expensive your car, the easier it is to steal.
The easier it is.
And
Sorry,
that
not
seems
the,
to, I mean,
it's obviously a bigger target. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing, because I would sort of thought, because Giles Corrin is someone I've known a bit for many years, and I sort of became aware that Giles's car was constantly being pinched, and he's got this really fancy kind of Jaguar half electric top of the range thing called a Jaguar I-Pace, and I was like, well, no wonder they're always stealing Giles's car, because he's got a really fancy car, whereas my car is not that fancy. It'll be fine because there's loads of Discovery Sports around on the street, but anyway, it turns out all of them are stolen.
What you get onto in the meat of the piece really is about how convenience has made us all terribly, terribly lazy, and that you talk about how with Amazon and so on, all sort of technology now is used to make us less and less responsible for our possessions.
Well, I think so. I mean, my thesis in the piece really was because I sort of noticed like these keyless entry systems, which obviously are a way of make it easier for your car to be stolen. They're still massively prevalent, and they're prevalent, I think, because they're attractive because they're so convenient. But the trouble of turning a key in a lock is not really an enormous trouble. It's a couple of seconds worth of difficulty. It's not like, for years the people have been yearning to be free of the need to actually stick their key into the car steering column to turn the car on, and now at last,
so we have ideas. Yeah.
And I think that does percolate through the whole of our culture, and particularly our economy, that there's a sense in which we're so accustomed to convenience, so keen on it, that we will trade an awful lot for the most marginal increases in convenience, including security. I mean, and of course, online. So much of what we do and so much of the digital economy is geared to the idea that people can't be asked to read the terms and conditions, that people will submit to any number of sort of potential invasions of their privacy or, different risks online, if you like, simply for the convenience of being able to, use, a cloud app that allows you to, edit your document wherever you're going or get free email or get, all the different things that we rely on online make our lives more convenient. Amazon's another classic example, is that it makes it much, much more convenient to shop because you just sit at home and you go, Amazon's, they don't pay their taxes and they're exploitative of their workers and, they're baddies, if you're a sort of hand-wringing type like me. But going to the bookshop, it's going to take hours, and this, by tomorrow afternoon, I've got this book in my hands, and it's cost me half the price, and bang.
Well, Sam, I wonder in light of this, if whether you're going to change your car and go back to a more traditional key car, or if you get your car back, are you just going to be very relieved and you'll go back to enjoying your keyless entry to your vehicle?
Well, you see, I'm very lazy because I've been conditioned by, late capitalism to be so. So I'm probably not going to change my car because that would be even more effort. But I have bought a Faraday box, which is the thing that stops them boosting it, and one of those big yellow bars that you put across the steering wheel, which apparently... Because thieves love convenience as well. And for them, keyless cars are great because they're very convenient to steal, whereas if you put an old-fashioned crook lock on it, it makes it inconvenient for them, so they can't be bothered. So the circle sort of, the wheel does come full circle in that respect. So I'm going to make a bit more effort to secure my car, and hopefully that will be a bar to entry for the thieves.
Well, I hope you avoid any more headaches, and thank you very much for bothering to come on.
Thank you.
That is it for this week. I hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, or even if you didn't, please subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. You can do that by hitting the button at the bottom of the screen, and also I'd encourage you to hit the bell, which will remind you every time we produce a new episode. There we go. Thank you very much for watching. Please tune in again next time.